Dylan Goes Electric, Newport, Seeger, and the Night That Split the Sixties by Elijah Wald. A pivotal moment in music history occurred at the 1965 Newport Folk Festival, Bob Dylan's controversial electric performance. This event, however, was more than just a concert. It was a reflection of the broader cultural and musical landscape of the early 1960s. The folk revival, the rise of rock and roll, and the changing social and political climate were all intertwined, with Dylan's journey serving as a lens through which to view these shifts. Two central figures dominated the era, Pete Seeger and Bob Dylan. Seeger, a stalwart of the folk scene, was deeply committed to the democratic ideals of folk music. He saw music as a tool for social change and community building, a champion of traditional music who encouraged amateur participation, believing that everyone could and should make music. He built his own log cabin outside of Beacon, New York, cooked over an open fire, and was a leader of the PTA when his children were in school. Seeger was known for his ability to connect with audiences, always encouraging them to sing along. He was a hard man to know and to like, but an easy man to admire. Dylan, on the other hand, emerged as a young, ambitious musician eager to break free from the constraints of tradition. Growing up in Hibbing, Minnesota, Dylan was drawn to the raw energy of rhythm and blues and early rock and roll, finding inspiration in artists like Johnny Ray, Hank Williams, Muddy Waters, and Howlin' Wolf. He was a fan of Elvis, but also found an affinity with Buddy Holly and James Dean. He had an uncle who owned a local theater, so he got to watch all the movies for free. He was a shy kid who loved music, movies, and motorcycles. He was fascinated by movies like Rebel Without a Cause and bought a red jacket like the one James Dean's character wore. He was always convinced he was going to be famous. He was inspired to become a rock and roller, playing in bands like the Golden Chords in his youth. He dismissed Ricky Nelson as an Elvis impersonator and said Elvis copied Clyde McPhatter. He was a fan of the Diamonds until he realized they copied all the little R&B groups. His first serious girlfriend was a working-class girl named Echo Hellstrom, who he met at a local cafe. Echo remembered him as a shy kid who lived in his own world. He played piano in high school, and his yearbook photo stated to join Little Richard. After high school, he worked for the summer in Fargo, North Dakota, and played with Bobby V's band, The Shadows. He went on to college in Minneapolis, but did not last long, preferring to hang out in coffee houses, bars, and friends' apartments. He quickly became a regular performer at these venues, singing songs by artists like Harry Belafonte, Odetta, and Woody Guthrie. The broader context of the folk revival included various factions, from purists who valued authenticity and traditional styles to those who embraced a more commercial, pop-oriented approach. The vibrant scene in Greenwich Village featured coffee houses, hootenannies, and informal jam sessions. Clubs like the Café Bazaar mixed haunted house decor with poets and folk swingers, and described themselves as where the beat meets the elite. A sketch of a beatnik in a beard, beret, and shades promised folk singing, comedy, calypso, congas, and poetry. Key figures like Dave Van Ronk, the mayor of McDougal Street, mentored Dylan, and the New Lost City Ramblers, a trio dedicated to reviving old-time string band music, also played a prominent role. These were just a few of the hundreds of groups that played folk music in the 1950s and 1960s. Tension existed between the purists and the popularizers, exemplified by the contrasting styles of groups like the Kingston Trio and performers like Seeger. The Kingston Trio, with their clean-cut image and commercial success, represented the mainstreaming of folk music. They were seen as a safe alternative to rock and roll, and became the defining pop-folk group of the early 1960s. Seeger, while admired for his musicianship and commitment to social causes, was often criticized for his perceived lack of authenticity and his encouragement of amateur participation. He was simultaneously parenting the pop-folk style with the Weavers, as well as its traditionalist opponents. Dylan's arrival in New York in 1961 marked a turning point. He quickly immersed himself in the village scene, befriending Van Ronk and other musicians, and making the pilgrimage to visit his idol, Woody Guthrie. He absorbed influences from a wide range of artists, including Ramblin' Jack Elliott, the Reverend Gary Davis, and Odetta. He introduced himself to the local scene by playing a couple of songs at a coffee house on McDougal Street. He told people he had grown up in New Mexico, run away from home many times, and had wandered all over the country. He was already developing his songwriting skills, but his early original compositions were often novelties within a larger repertoire of traditional and blues-based material. His first formal club gig was at Gerde's Folk City. His talents were soon recognized by legendary producer John Hammond, who signed him to Columbia Records. His first album, Bob Dylan, was released in 1962, showcasing a mix of traditional songs and original compositions. While the album did not achieve immediate commercial success, it established Dylan as a unique voice in the folk world. The rise of topical songwriting, a movement that sought to address contemporary social and political issues through music, was gaining momentum. Broadside, a small newsletter edited by Sis Cunningham, became a forum for this new wave of songwriters, including Dylan, Tom Paxton, Phil Ochs, and others. Dylan's early topical songs, such as Talking John Birch, Paranoid Blues, and The Death of Emmett Till, tackled issues like racism, war, and the Cold War. However, his songwriting quickly evolved beyond straightforward protest songs. Blowin' in the Wind, written in 1962, became an anthem of the era, but it was more a series of questions than a direct call to action. Dylan was more interested in exploring the complexities of human experience than in providing easy answers. Dylan grew uncomfortable with being labeled a protest singer and increasingly focused on more personal, introspective themes. He began to distance himself from the overtly political songs of his earlier work, exploring themes of love, loss, and alienation. His performances became more experimental, incorporating elements of blues, rock and roll, and surreal imagery. He was also becoming a star, attracting the attention of manager Albert Grossman, who saw in Dylan the potential for both artistic and commercial success. The 1963 Newport Folk Festival marked a turning point in the folk revival. The festival, under the leadership of Pete Seeger and a board of directors that included Theodore Beichel and Peter Yarrow, aimed to showcase a wide range of traditional and contemporary folk music. It was a non-profit event designed to support traditional artists from rural communities. The festival was a celebration of diversity, featuring not only established stars like Seeger and Joan Baez, but also lesser-known traditional performers and emerging young songwriters. The festival highlighted the unique talents of Mississippi John Hurt and Doc Watson, among other lesser-known artists. Dylan's performance at the festival, where he shared the stage with Seeger, Baez, and the Freedom Singers, cemented his status as a leading voice of his generation. He sang new songs like With God on Our Side and Only a Pawn in Their Game, which addressed issues of war, racism, and social injustice. The crowd of 13,000 people was mesmerized when Dylan, Peter, Paul, and Mary, Joan Baez, the Freedom Singers, Pete Seeger, and Theodore Beichel joined together to sing Blowin' in the Wind. They closed the show with a moving rendition of We Shall Overcome. However, the 1963 festival also revealed the growing tensions within the folk community. The arrival of commercial acts like Peter, Paul, and Mary, and the increasing popularity of Dylan's more personal, less overtly political songs, sparked debates about the direction of the movement. Some purists criticized Dylan for abandoning his protest roots, while others saw his evolution as a natural progression. The broader cultural shifts of the mid-1960s, including the rise of the civil rights movement, the escalation of the Vietnam War, and the growing influence of rock and roll, further complicated the landscape. The assassination of President Kennedy in 1963 and the subsequent rise of the Beatles marked a turning point, with many young people turning away from the optimism of the early 1960s and embracing a more rebellious, countercultural ethos. The Beatles' arrival on the American scene in 1964 was a cultural earthquake. Their infectious pop tunes and rebellious image captured the imagination of a generation and signaled a shift away from the earnestness of the folk revival. Dylan himself was impressed by the Beatles' energy and musicality, and their influence can be heard in his subsequent work. Dylan's 1965 album, Bringing It All Back Home, marked a decisive break with his earlier acoustic style. The album featured electric instrumentation on one side, and while the other side was acoustic, the lyrics were more surreal and introspective than his previous work. The album's release coincided with the rise of folk rock, a new genre that blended the social consciousness of folk music with the energy and instrumentation of rock and roll. The Byrds' electric cover of Dylan's Mr. Tambourine Man became a massive hit, demonstrating the commercial potential of this new sound. The stage was now set for the 1965 Newport Folk Festival. Dylan arrived at the festival a changed artist. He had embraced electric instrumentation, his songwriting had become more complex and ambiguous, and he was increasingly uncomfortable with the expectations of the folk audience. He was no longer the earnest young protest singer of 1963. He was a rock star, with all the trappings of fame and fortune. He was also being hailed as the voice of a generation, a role he was not always comfortable with. The 1965 festival was a watershed moment. The lineup was more diverse than ever, featuring traditional performers, established folk stars, and emerging rock and blues acts. The Paul Butterfield Blues Band, an integrated group featuring the fiery guitar work of Mike Bloomfield, made a powerful impression with their amplified Chicago blues. Their performance, along with the appearance of other electric acts, signaled a shift in the festival's aesthetic and a growing acceptance of rock and roll within the folk community. Dylan's performance on Sunday night, July 25, 1965, has become legendary. Backed by members of the Butterfield Band and organist Al Cooper, he launched into an electric set that included Maggie's Farm, Like a Rolling Stone, and a chaotic, under-rehearsed version of It Takes a Lot to Laugh, It Takes a Train to Cry. The sound was loud, distorted, and unlike anything the Newport audience had heard before. The reaction was mixed. Some cheered, some booed, some were simply stunned. The details of the performance have been debated for decades. Some witnesses recall Seeger being so upset that he threatened to cut the power cables with an axe. Others dispute this story, claiming that Seeger was primarily concerned about the poor sound quality. Whatever the specifics, it is clear that Dylan's electric set was a shock to the system. He followed his electric set by returning to the stage alone with an acoustic guitar. He sang It's All Over Now, Baby Blue, and Mr. Tambourine Man. The aftermath of Dylan's performance was immediate and profound. Some in the folk community felt betrayed, accusing Dylan of selling out to commercialism and abandoning his commitment to social change. Others saw his move as a bold artistic statement, a rejection of the limitations of the folk genre and an embrace of new possibilities. The incident became a symbol of the generational and cultural shifts of the mid-1960s, the moment when the folk revival gave way to the rock revolution. Dylan's music was changing, and so was the world around him. The optimism of the early 1960s had faded, replaced by a more complex and uncertain mood. The civil rights movement was facing new challenges, the Vietnam War was escalating, and the counterculture was beginning to emerge. In the years that followed, Dylan continued to evolve as an artist, exploring new musical styles and lyrical themes. He became a major rock star, but he never completely abandoned his folk roots. He continued to write songs that addressed social and political issues, and he remained a powerful voice for change. The Newport Folk Festival also evolved, struggling to adapt to the changing musical landscape. It continued to showcase traditional music, but it also embraced rock and other genres. The festival's influence waned in the late 1960s, but it remained a symbol of the folk revival and its legacy. Dylan's electric performance at Newport was not simply a musical event, but a cultural turning point, a moment that revealed the deep divisions and transformations that were reshaping American society. It was a clash between tradition and modernity, between acoustic and electric, between the earnest idealism of the folk revival and the rebellious energy of rock and roll. The book does not offer easy answers or simplistic judgments. Instead, it invites readers to consider the complexities of the era and the enduring power of music to reflect and shape our world. Dylan's journey, from his early days as a folk singer to his embrace of rock and roll and beyond, serves as a powerful reminder that art, like life, is a constant process of evolution and change. The clashing ideals represented by Seeger and Dylan that night are still with us, and some still feel forced to choose between the two. However, both Dylan and Seeger long ago recognized that the challenge was not to defend one against the other, but to reconcile the two. Dylan circled back to his musical roots while also exploring new directions. He became a gospel singer, a country singer, an acoustic blues and ballad singer, and a Southern roots music revivalist. He is the only major performer of the 1960s who consistently draws audiences of new, young fans. Seeger continued to play concerts all over the country and around the world, and made his last album in 2010. Today, the Newport Folk Festival is a showcase for the Americana scene, with electric guitars mixing with fiddles and mandolins. The central conflict of that night in 1965 was timeless: the democratic ideal of a society working together for the common good versus the ideal of the free individual, unburdened by rules or customs. If you enjoyed this book breakdown, please consider liking this video and subscribing to get notified when we post our next book.